what I think is a real amazing contribution to the climate movement, which is the youth movement. Yeah. You know, I'm 36 years old. It took me a little bit to kind of get what the youth movement was. You know, they're not necessarily always with NGOs that I know, and they're like blogging and like, what is this thing? And then, you know, I hang out in New York with 350, and I'm like, okay, this is this thing. This is pretty amazing. And as I'm here, I hear these stories about you know, leaders, amazing, passionate leaders that aren't just passionate and aren't just attracting thousands and thousands of people around them, but they're actually changing policies and changing directions of what countries are doing here and negotiating. And that's what we wanted to talk about tonight. So I'm going to introduce our blogger, Richard Graves, who has put together this panel for the night. And he's going to talk about the speakers, and we're going to get going here. This is live stream to live.tickticktick.org. If anyone wants to tweet that. Yeah, one last thing, you know, ultimately what we're trying to do here with this whole thing, with Tick Tick Tick, with the Fresh Air Center, is really let the world know that there's a huge, diverse movement that's ready for change. It's big, it's diverse as heck, and it's active as heck. And we demand a real deal, and we demand the things that we demand. Fair, ambitious, and binding is what we use at Tick. So the more that we can do to like be tweeting, to be blogging, to be spreading the messages about what we're doing, sharing each other's stories. You know, everyone came here with your own story, but there's also other amazing stories here. That's how we're going to break through. You know, that's how we're going to break through and get our stories heard. We're all kind of talking about similar things. So really just encourage you to help grow this space and help grow all of our stories. So Richard, let's get her going.
Everyone to really get to know our speakers tonight, which are going to be speaking after we play 3 videos. Is that right? So I'm going to introduce them right after these videos, but we have some of the right now that we just want to play for the audience, show some of the examples of both what civil society and some of the youth organizations that are here have really worked together on. And then we're going to talk about how you can actually directly influence negotiations.
Here in Copenhagen. We have a great crowd of folks here in Copenhagen. An intrepid band of free market activists who are joining us. Copenhagen has been an eye-opener for me. I have to tell you, having never attended a United Nations sponsored conference, I kind of hope this is my last one, I believe, but it's been an eye-opener for us. We can, across the country, really.
We're sorry, we didn't announce it.
And I'll tell you this, it's interesting to hear this.
childish demonstration by people who do not believe in free speech that should be on these people now. They are indeed the crazed Hitler youth. They know no climate science. They know nothing. You are listening now to the shouts in the background of the Hitler youth who have sprayed the whole of Copenhagen with green slogans of a childishness and pathetic.
People around the world are using today as a day of action in fighting climate change. Hundreds of environment campaigners gathered in Edinburgh today.
D'action mondiale contre le réchauffement climatique.
Mehr als 200 Klimaaktivisten.
Dia de ação mundial para alertar contra as alterações climáticas.
So we saw three very different representations of youth activism, one of which was definitely sort of what a lot of you might have seen already here, which was young people providing some of the really the manpower and the backbones for a lot of the actions, particularly actions around calls for sort of the ethical and moral elements of a climate treaty, such as with Tuvalu, which already has influenced the sort of the layout of the climate conference already. Another, which is a little bit different, is the label of Hitler Youth, which some of the right-wing deniers and skeptics that really are scared of what might come out of this climate talk are using against, to demagogue against the young people because they recognize how powerful they are. As seen when that video which you saw was actually, that was a live webcast to 50 cities. And the fact that young people, including entrepreneurs and people looking for, to develop clean energy, came together and presented a very different model and vision of what prosperity means was incredibly effective. And that's why they were so worried. And then last was the fact that young people really anchored or backboned the most widespread day of political action in history, the 350 International Day of Climate Action, which we have many of the organizers here. And I think they know that while it wasn't, the International Day of Climate Action wasn't about it being a youth organizing day, but youth really were some of the earliest adopters, and many of the people that showed up or organized or really took part and made it happen were young people around the world. And so those three different perspectives, I'd actually like to introduce our three speakers. If they'd like to come up, we have Anna Rose, who's the founder, co-founder, and executive director of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. She couch surfed her way as another leading youth organizer in the U.S. did into creating the largest and most widespread youth movement in Australian history. She represents the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, which brings together over 50,000 young Australians, which is, I believe, larger than many political parties in Australia, than all political parties in Australia combined. And has some incredible stories of how organizing in a developed country that's nevertheless facing extraordinary impacts from climate change. The next, I'd like to introduce Deepa Gupta. Deepa is the executive director of the Indian Youth Climate Network, which in some ways is one of the fastest growing youth networks in the world, coming, from basically not existing before the since before the Bali climate talks, to bringing a huge delegation representing a large and incredibly engaged youth population in India working on climate solutions. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to invite Jesse Tolkien. The executive director of the Energy Action Coalition.
Yeah, this is so tall for me.
I actually used to work for Jesse. And Jesse has been one of the hardest working organizers in any part of the youth, in part of the entire global climate movement, working through some incredible difficulties to lead a coalition that represents over 50 youth organizations in the United States, with chapters on well over 1,000 campuses, and has organized some of the largest citizen youth conferences in the world, Power Shift 07 and Power Shift 09, and represents hundreds of thousands of youth leaders all across the United States. So one of the things we want to bring these leaders here for is they're exceptional, and they're amazing people, but they're also can tell us a very specific story. Each of them has seen the fact that youth are often sort of heralded at these talks. They're seen to as sort of a symbol of conscience, or as a sign of something important at these talks, but they're not necessarily always seen as having a real impact or influence. But the truth is that there are some major changes in the course of these negotiations, particularly over the last 2 years, that have been really initiated and led by youth. And so we're going to hear some stories about how young people have actually, with relatively little money, but with some good ideas, some tech savvy, and real passion, have actually shifted the course of both the national politics around climate change and the international climate negotiations. So maybe could we start with Anna? And we'll have questions after all of them speak. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, so Richard wants me to speak about specific instances where young people have influenced the negotiations. So I've got 2.5 examples to give you, and stories of things that we've done in Australia and also with international youth. So cast your mind back to a few years ago. The Australian government was led by a guy called John Howard, shame, who didn't believe in climate change. And in fact, one of his ministers suggested that to save the Great Barrier Reef, we should cover it with a giant shade cloth instead of reducing emissions. So this is the kind of government that we had a few years ago. And young people back then were starting to get really organised on climate change. The AYCC set up under John Howard and was one of the reasons why I think we grew so quickly at the beginning, because his climate policies were non-existent. So we had been running a campaign with young people from all around Australia through the Australian Student Environment Network, which is now one of the coalition groups of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. And I mean, I don't have a story of a particular creative moment that changed everything in Australia, but it was more a case of, over years and years and years, young people and other non-government organisations deciding that they would start a campaign around Australia ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. And I remember we were having some discussions and people said, we can't do a campaign around the Kyoto Protocol. No one knows what Kyoto is or where it is, and no one understands the word protocol. But we had to do it, and we did. And in a few years after that campaign, sign the Kyoto, or ratify Kyoto, had become a rallying cry in Australia. And particularly just before John Howard was defeated in the 2007 election, you would see everywhere pencils and bumper stickers and bike stickers and posters, and it was all about Kyoto. And that's why Australia has been said to have had the world's first climate change election. In 2007, climate change was one of the top 3 issues in if you look at the exit polls and all the polls. So what that did was it meant that the new government, the Rudd government, had no choice but to campaign on climate change and to promise that they would ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And a big part of that had been young people in Montreal and beyond reporting back to the Australian public about what this Kyoto Protocol actually was and why it was important for Australia to be part of a global deal on climate change. So we had the climate change election, our new government got elected, and its first act was Kevin Rudd to ratify Kyoto in Bali, which was a big step forward for Australia. So that's my story, my first story about how Australian youth and the movement were able to influence the negotiations. We actually finally got our country to sign on. But I want to talk about something that happened yesterday where we're directly influencing the framing of the negotiations that's happening in Australia. And I don't know if you've heard, but about a week ago, we had a new leader of the opposition elected in Australia who doesn't believe in climate change, and he's totally nuts, basically. And so he said yesterday at a doorstop interview that solving climate change would cost Australia $400 billion, and he was wrong by $386 billion, completely out. But this number started to get picked up in the Australian media really quickly, $400 billion, all over talkback, everywhere. It just was sticking in people's heads. So what we did was a rapid response blogging campaign, and we made a spoof video. There's this video going around in Australia at the moment. A big major bank is trying to sell its rate increase of 5%. They made a little advertisement comparing home loans to banana smoothies and why bananas are now more expensive, therefore home loans are now more expensive. Anyway, it's been a top media story in Australia. So we got our video team into action and we made a video within about 5 hours, which we then spread, and it's been on the homepage today of a number of the major news sites in Australia. And we've gotten fantastic media coverage with the headline, the exact headline that we wanted, which was Tony Abbott's wrong by $386 billion on his costings. So that's pretty cool. So I think that's the two kind of things that we can do. The substantive, let's get them to change their position, and then let's change the framing of the way that these negotiations are being perceived. But finally, I just want to say, and the other thing is we've reached so far in the last 3 days of these negotiations, we've reached 4 million Australians, which is a 1/5 of our population, with the media that the AYCC has generated. Okay, but finally, and this isn't what Richard wanted me to talk about, it's not a tangible outcome, but I actually think one of the most amazing and special things that has come out of the global youth presence at the climate negotiations is the ability that it gives us as a youth movement to be able to organise with each other, share from each other and learn from each other. And if I hadn't been at the UN negotiations in Montreal in 2005, then I wouldn't have set up the Youth Climate Coalition in Australia. And that's 50,000 young people that may not be involved in climate change. So it was the global youth movement that inspired me to do that and my team to do that, and it's the global movement that keeps us going.
Hi everybody, I'm Jessie Tolkien, and I'm incredibly lucky to be the executive director. I need to stand up. To be the executive director of the Energy Action Coalition. And what I have been feeling since I arrived here in Copenhagen is, thank goodness we have an international youth climate movement. I can't imagine what this would all look like if we didn't have an international youth climate movement. I have had a remarkable 3.5, 4 years being a leader in the youth climate movement in the United States. And I spent the morning actually being interviewed on the kind of history and building of the Energy Action Coalition. And it was a pretty remarkable experience because the first question this woman asked me was, is there any way that I could have predicted when I started my time with Energy Action that we would be where we are today? And I said, there's absolutely no way I could have had any vision that we'd be where we are today. But now that we're here, we just still have so much further to go, right? So it's like awesome to share in the excitement about the accomplishments, but it's also quite humbling to realize that we have a long way to go. I did not grow up in the youth climate movement. I was not an environmentalist growing up, but a very dear friend of mine who is the co-founder of the Energy Action Coalition, Billy Parrish, he invited me to come to Montreal. He said, you know, Jessie, I think you've mobilized a lot of young people to vote in the United States. You know a lot about youth organizing. Will you please come to Montreal and do some trainings on strategic planning? And here I was all flattered that Billy Parrish wanted me to do some trainings for young people in the environmental movement in the United States and around the world. But I didn't realize that this was just his grand recruitment plan for me to come and join the youth climate movement. And normally I can see through that stuff because I'm a pretty good organizer. But it worked, and it worked incredibly well because in Montreal, I fell in love with the youth climate movement. I realized that, in fact, I'd been spending my life trying to build political power for young people so that young people in the United States could make an impact on the issue of climate change. And that's what I've spent the past 3.5 years trying to do. So when I started at Energy Action Coalition in 2006, we had the Bush administration. That wasn't working out so well for us. We had the start of an unbelievable coalition of organizations that absolutely had the potential to create unbelievable things. We were just starting to run a campaign called the Campus Climate Challenge. We had a little bit of money and a couple of paid staff. And all these years later, we now have almost 60 full-time paid staff across the United States, and we have a network of over 500,000 young people. We've got millions of dollars that foundations have been gracious enough to invest in our work. And those are all great accomplishments, but the thing that makes me proud to wake up every morning is that on more than 1,000 college campuses across America, we have actually passed policy to make our college campuses models of the clean energy future. In hundreds of communities, we are changing the way that those communities operate. In 2007, we decided that we needed a national moment for the youth climate movement to come together and show that we were real. And we decided to get kind of political. So we held the biggest lobby day up to that point at PowerShift 2007, and we brought 6,000 people to Washington, D.C. to tell the United States Congress what most of the environmental movement in the United States wasn't willing to say, that an energy bill wasn't enough, that we actually needed a climate bill. Then we decided, you know, that we needed a climate election in the United States, and that 8 years of George Bush was just too much, and that we couldn't stay focused on our college campuses. So in the 2008 election, 350,000 of us decided that we would vote for climate. And yeah, a whole bunch of us voted for a guy named Barack Obama, and that turned out to be a pretty cool election for the United States. But of all the things we've done, I think it's actually these past few months that I am most proud of. In fact, I'm about to move on from the Energy Action Coalition. And the thing that's so terrifying is that I may have had like the most incredible job and most incredible organizing experience of my entire life, and I'm only 28 years old. But what I'm most proud of is not that 350,000 of us participated in the Power Vote campaign or that we helped elect Barack Obama president. I'm proud that we've had the courage to hold Barack Obama accountable. That when the rest of the progressive movement and the environmental movement decided that it wasn't okay to tell Obama he needed to be stronger, that the young people in the United States said that was exactly our responsibility. And just about 2 months ago, we launched a campaign called It's Game Time Obama, because let's be honest, it is game time. It's game time for the world. And we put out some strong demands of the president. We said he needed to go to Copenhagen. And not only did he decide to go, but he's changed his travel plans even since making that decision, which we feel like we had a small little bit to do with. We said he had to meet with young people. We all watched on TV as President Obama met with Chinese youth for 2 hours on his trip to Asia, which was amazing, and we feel very lucky that he was able to meet with Chinese youth. But in fact, it was American youth that put him in office, and he or his administration hadn't spent a whole lot of time with us. So then he invited 150 of us to meet with his top 4 advisors on climate and energy and his top secretaries. And last Wednesday, 150 of us met with him, and we met with his advisors, and we made it clear that while we're very impressed with their accomplishments, that those accomplishments are no excuse for him coming to Copenhagen and fighting for a globally binding agreement. And we're really proud to be one of the constituencies standing up. And we've continued that here at the negotiations in Copenhagen. We were there to tell Jonathan Pershing that it's not enough. We were there to push Lisa Jackson to go further because she's one of our heroes at the Environmental Protection Agency. And I know that the United States youth will not give up, that they will continue to fight. They will fight through these negotiations, and they will, I think, take the inspiration from an international youth movement that I will dare say is more radical and more passionate than they are, and go back to the United States and realize that they have a responsibility to get their government in order and ready to act over the course of 2010. I have absolutely no doubt that we will look back on history and know that it was young people that made the difference in 2009 and 2010. And I'll just close by saying that it is, without a doubt, one of my life's honors to be on a stage with 2 remarkable women who are changing the world and inspiring people to make this world the kind of place it needs to be. So thank you very much.
Thank you, I agree. I'm sharing the stage with 2 remarkable women. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Well, Richard asked us to speak about how young people are impacting the negotiations. And I thought I'd speak on a more international level of how we've seen young people really impact these negotiations. So my first negotiations were last year in Poznan. And when we came in like, okay, let me start. Traditionally, the UN has never facilitated for young people to participate in this process, even though it's absolutely critical that young people participate in this process. And I think the first biggest achievement that we've made is we've found a place within here. This year, for the first time, We have now official youth constituency. We now have a little desk in the negotiating room where we can speak on behalf of younger. And I think that in itself is an amazing achievement politically as well, because it's saying that youth are an official constituency that have to be considered separate from country agendas. Now, secondly, so as young people initially came in, it was quite hard to figure out how we can be most impacting. And last year when we came into Poznan, I think there was a similar feeling of, okay, we're doing actions and media, but it was hard to figure out how, in the bigger scheme of things, we would actually make a change without being, I guess, a spectacle or just, you know, these group of fun young people. And I think we saw it really shift last year when we did something called Project Survival, which was a campaign that, in my opinion, sent out waves beyond just the negotiations. And it all started where we formed our first political strategy group, and we were sort of talking about what the state of play was in politics. And what we were noticing also was that the delegations from developing countries, especially island nations and the least developed countries of the world, were very small. And the whole process in itself was inequitable. Like, you had countries like Australia and the US that had delegations with like 30 people, and then you had other delegations which had like 2 people, and they had to follow the same number of policies. And it was absolutely ridiculous. And so we started off with just helping these delegations out. We were like, okay, well, how about we help you like get coffee, do photocopying, and, you know, maybe research some policy to actually try and see how we could support them have their voices heard. So that was step one, okay, trying to impact the negotiations tangibly. However, as we built these relationships up with the AOSIS and LDC countries, we started talking, and they were like, well, this is all well and fine, but the bigger problem is that our voices are being lost in these negotiations. No one is listening to what we are saying. And at this specific point in time, also, these countries came out with lobbying for 350 parts per million, a target that young people believed in as well. And so as we moved forward, we were like, okay, well, you know, how can we keep this moving? How can we make sure that 350 parts per million is adopted? And we were trying to understand how the whole process worked. And we realized that at that point in time, what we had to influence was the negotiating text. We had to get 350 parts per million in the negotiating text. We had to get the principle of survival in the negotiating text. And so that's when the actual survival campaign began. In the final 4 days of COP, we decided on this. And in the final 3 days of COP, we came up with a slogan and printed off hundreds of pledges to get a pledge signed by the different countries. And also we're like, well, to actually get this into the negotiating text, you have to have the different delegates and ministers actually speak about it. So we went around and simultaneously introduced ourselves to every delegate we could find, like be they sitting like near a plenary room or be they eating lunch. We would go up to them and like introduce myself, like I'd be like, oh, hi, I'm Deepa, I'm from the International Youth Movement. We're trying to get, I think we were like, oh, do you believe that survival that all people and nations are entitled to survival? And the default answer for most countries was, yes, of course. And then we were like, well, why don't you commit your delegation to signing this pledge? And so slowly we got 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 countries to sign on. At this point, they were mainly like African and island nations. But slowly, we also started getting bigger countries on board. We started getting Italy, and we started getting UK. And we started seeing, we also had delegations that said no, like countries like India and Australia and Canada initially said, no, we're not going to sign it. But by the end of it, when we had gotten so many different countries to sign the pledge, and when we had actually gotten ministers and delegates to talk about survival being not negotiable and the fact that every peoples and nations have a right to survival, we had countries on like the second last and last day actually running up to us saying that they wanted to sign the survival pledge. And it was really exciting because we'd managed to politically make these different countries actually work against each other and leverage off like the idea of credibility and power. And what was really exciting was, there were many exciting moments. One was when Penny Wong actually referenced what the young people were doing and referenced our pledge. And the second exciting moment was when we actually saw the entire line that what was the line?
Survival is not negotiable.
No, on the pledge.
Oh, safeguard the survival of all countries and peoples.
Yep. To ensure the survival of all countries and peoples, and 350 parts per million in the text, we knew that we'd been successful. Like that's what we had set out for, and we'd finally gotten it. It was so exciting. But like not only that, beyond that, over this past year, we've seen NGOs adopt that language. We've seen different media houses adopt that language. And now as we come into COP15, everyone's talking about survival as a basic principle. When last year in COP14, people weren't talking about climate change as an issue of survival, this year it is the fundamental behind what a lot of countries are pushing for. So that for me was success number 2 on an international level. And I think like the 2 stories we've heard so far are about how domestically we influence the negotiations. Because here it's only when the countries come to the table to negotiate, but a lot of the changes happen back at home. And so for me, from an India perspective, what has been really amazing for us is our story starts out of Bali. Like that's when the idea and inspiration came in to start the Indian Youth Climate Network. And 1 year down the track last year, when we came to COP14 for the first time, we met our Indian negotiators for the first time as well. And I don't know how much you know about social movements in India, but there's really not an environment of engaging civil society for government. Like government don't really consult civil society a lot, and obviously there's a lot of corruption. And like traditionally, like it's very hard to get in touch with our government members, and there's a lot of hierarchy, and like you're meant to respect them in a certain way, and there's like it's just very hard to get your point across. But anyway, the point being was that by being in Poznan last year, we were able to build relationships which we continued throughout the year. And for an organisation that's only 1.5 years old, in July this year, we actually had the Ministry of Environment get in touch with us and ask us what our climate change policy was. And we had no idea why they were asking us. And 2 days later, we found out that they'd read it out in Parliament. And it was an amazing milestone for us because A, climate change was not on the agenda in India even like 1.5 to 2 years ago. B, young people are discouraged from having their voices heard. Our culture is such that we respect our elders and we're meant to listen to what our elders believe in. And finally, our government is not known for engaging civil society, so the fact that they asked us meant that they're finally starting to realise that young people are a constituency to engage, and they've obviously seen the relevance of that in the international arena. So those are sort of like the 3 most exciting stories of how we've sort of seen young people go out into the world and make a difference in these negotiations, both domestically and internationally. And I would just like to say, I think these negotiations are going to be absolutely incredible. And for me, one of the most inspiring stories at the moment is that of the climate justice fast, where we have fasters that are now on day 35 of not eating anything except for consuming water, which is absolutely amazing. And the reason I think that this will be one of the biggest things that will make a difference in these negotiations is because it's taking activism to an absolutely new level. Often we are telling our negotiators and our leaders what we want them to do, but by fasting, we are forcing them to reflect on what they are doing as opposed to telling them what they should be doing. And so by forcing them to reflect, I think we will push them to internally change. And even if we don't see our treaty this year, there will be enough of a change in attitude and ethic, both within our negotiations and the rest of the world, to see the treaty that we want to see in the very near future.
So actually, Deepa, you're fasting yourself, right?
I'm solidarity fasting, so I eat 1 meal a day. I'm on day 10.
Okay. It's actually, if you're a journalist here or a blogger, I would really advise you to actually go and talk to one of the climate justice fasters. You're not going to hear another story that's more impassioned or a human interest story really more powerful than that. The fact that people have literally not eaten for more than 30 days to try and bring attention to the fact that people will be starving on a massive scale from climate change is really an incredible act of activism that has a historical legacy that really is incredibly powerful. But I also want to open up the floor for questions. I know a lot of people here are professional question askers. So I'd love to see some people ask about some of the things that people have been talking about, what's happening, what people will be doing after the COP, what do they think was going to be happening here, and what the role of youth will be over the next week and a half. Because as we know, these things move fast, and you never know what's going to happen. I don't think we have a roving microphone, but if someone wants to just ask a question, I'll repeat it into the mic, and we can have directed at any one of our speakers or at the group as a whole. So, any questions? Oh, we got one all the way in the back over there. He's going to come up for a second.
Should I start from here? Yeah. Hi, this is for the entire panel. The topic I've been interested in is the mental health impacts of climate change. Sorry, it's for the entire panel. One of the topics I'm interested in is the mental health impacts of climate change, including the sort of pre-traumatic stress that sometimes activists are going through as they look at the kind of response that's necessary versus what is being done to actually address the issue. How are you folks working amongst your various groups to deal with the inevitable ups and downs of this kind of work?
We're actually doing a study at the moment. We're partnering with a health organisation in Australia to do a study on the mental health impacts of climate change, particularly on children. And yeah, I mean, anecdotally, working with young people, we do a lot of work in high schools especially, and it's very overwhelming to learn about the situation that our planet is in and know that we have the solutions right here, right now, to solve it. We're not waiting on new technology to be invented. And then see the massive chasm between the politics on climate change and the science. And I mean, how we deal with that in these negotiations is we have a welfare officer within our delegation of 30 young people and 11 young Pacific Islanders, and we have 2 welfare officers whose job is to keep the group talking about how we're feeling about the negotiations. But the other thing that's going on right now with I guess, mental health in our movement today in particular, it's interesting that you asked because 3 of our delegation, myself, my co-director and our media director, got death threats from a climate denialist over email, and then there was a bomb scare at our hotel. So that's not having a great impact on our mental health at the moment, and I think there are people out there who are working their hardest to try to get us shaken.
I mean, I think it's a very real issue. I mean, in the 3.5 years that I've been with Energy Action, I have seen some of the most remarkable and brilliant activists burn themselves out. People who we absolutely need in this fight for the long term. And so I think too late we are waking up to the fact that we need to think about our mental health and our well-being, because there is no doubt that even if we were to get the perfect deal here in Copenhagen, which we all know is an incredible long shot, that the fight for a truly just future and just climate policy across the world is something that we will all be fighting for a very, very long time. So it's something to take really seriously. I would say on a personal level, I take enormous inspiration from the movements of the past, the movements that I think we're following in their footsteps. Before I left to come to Copenhagen, and I had a holiday party with my staff. I gave them a book that I read this year that changed my life, which is called Walking with the Wind. It's the story of John Lewis, who is an amazing American who was born to parents who were sharecroppers in the Deep South, and he grew up, and he ultimately was one of the co-founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which played a fundamental role in the civil rights movement, and had a remarkable career, and currently sits in the United States Congress. And I get very nervous to compare the climate movement to the civil rights movement, because I'm not sure that they can or should be compared. But I will say that what those young activists endured in many ways pales in comparison to what many of us in the United States at this point have endured. So there's tremendous inspiration from the brilliant people that have paved the way for us to be able to have the power and ability to be making change that we're making right now.
I completely hear what you're saying. I think that climate change is such an issue especially because it's time-bound, it really pushes us to work incredibly hard, which is very unhealthy for us. And I'll simply speak about my own experience. Like, I was working, 12 hours on average a day, 6 to 7 days a week, most of this year. And I think like what made me really shift the way I've engaged with it is realizing Gandhi's quote, "Be the change that you want to see in the world," is not just about the action that you take, it's about how you live every moment of your life. And the change that I want to see in the world is where we are looking after ourselves and living the morals and values that we want to build. And if I was working 12 hours a day, I was building the value of the fact that we should be working all the time and not looking after our families and not building up love. And I fundamentally think the only way we can shift this and change climate change is by engaging with the heart. And if I didn't spend that time engaging with my own heart, I wouldn't be able to set that example for anyone else to do so. And so, I mean, organizationally, we aren't officially doing it this way, but for me to influence the Indian Youth Climate Network, the way that I'm doing it now is I'm reducing the amount I work and trying to be an example of the fact that it is okay for us to work less, and it's okay, like, I'm trying to run meditations at COP, that it's okay to spend an hour meditating, and it's okay to sleep 6 hours a night, even if we're at COP, because it's just when we live the change, as opposed to just talk about the change, is only when we'll be able to change.
I think we've got another question in the back there. I'll just repeat the question.
First of all, it's shocking to hear that the speaker has stated. We're coming from the representing the social and climate justice part of WTO in Geneva up to COP15. And we'll be falling under the CGA actions to open up the process in 16. But I'd like to ask the panel about where the role of media comes into the opening up and trying to open up a truly open dialogue for all the global movements. Just, for example, one of our people as well has received a death threat 2 weeks ago in South Colombia because of gold mining, and his fellow leader was shot dead 2 weeks ago. We're looking for support and solidarity to try to make sure that the rest of the people on the list aren't assassinated because of all of this climate systems.
So the question, which is quite serious, is about both the role of the media here in opening up the process, as well as in holding people accountable and the role of actually protecting people by calling attention to the fact that people are receiving death threats, and that many of the activists that have come here come from countries that people are facing real violence on the ground. And whether they're from Australia and receiving a death threat, or whether another country where there's a legacy of violence against activists, You know, what both does the media have the role for opening up Copenhagen as well as looking at things at home?
Just to clarify, we're the social and planners, just as caravan is coming from WTO to Copenhagen with 60 representative social movements from the global south to give testimony to their situations. Thank you. We will be falling into the CJA actions on the 16th to open up the process for a truly participant open dialogue on issues. So how us as techies, media, etc., how we can fall in and accommodate a true dialogue on issues.
Thank you.
I think one of the ways that I mean, for me, activism and changing people's hearts and minds on climate change is about stories and about dialogue. And one of the very first things that I did when I started getting involved in climate activism when I was about 14 was we started up this campaign, but it all came from stories, like sharing our stories from different communities where I lived, coal miners, traditional owners, high school students, and these old residents. And we all kind of got together, told our stories about this place we were trying to protect, and that led to the campaign. But why this is relevant to what you just said is I think now we just have the opportunity to tell those stories and share our ideas and our strategies and our hopes on a global scale. And when we were in Montreal, a bunch of us set up a blog called itsgettinghotinhere.org, which is now an incredible way of us to collaborate and communicate and hear those testimonies that you were talking about from all around the world. And that is not just relevant to the country that the person is writing from, it's relevant to our whole movement. So I completely agree. Media in Australia for our movement is essential. We're constantly blogging and tweeting and making videos and talking to each other because we're such a big country. I mean, same with all of our countries, they're so physically big, and the whole world. So yeah, I agree.
I think it's a huge problem, you know. I'm even in shock of the difference between watching news here in Copenhagen and watching news at home. I mean, the United States just doesn't cover climate, period. And when they decide to cover climate, or they decide to cover our movement, they decide to cover, you know, a ridiculous email scandal that is trying to set us back 10 years to the beginning of the Bush administration. So we have an enormous challenge on our hands to actually engage the public in a true and honest dialogue about what's happening. And we have to be incredibly thankful for the fact that we live in a day and age where in many countries we have the opportunity to be producing that media ourselves. And I look to people like Richard Graves and Shadia Wood over there and remarkable trailblazers in this space who, before there even was a big audience, were proponents of creating our own media and getting the stories out there. We all have to be bloggers. We all have to feel like what we're saying is something that is worth being said, that we have to tell our stories and share it with the world, and it is incredibly frustrating. I mean, I felt like it was newsworthy that the constituency that elected President Obama went to meet with his administration. It appeared in no publications. Apparently that was not newsworthy, right? The international community is convening over the greatest problem, arguably, that this world has ever seen. And you can read the front covers of most every publication in the United States and see almost nothing about the negotiations, but ridiculous blabber about what they're calling ClimateGate. So that is a huge challenge that's on our hands, and we need to address it like we're addressing everything else. It needs to be the power of the people that create the media, that tell the story, that do their best to break into the mainstream media or provide people the alternative options to be able to get the real news. And it means that our organizing has to take on those multiple dimensions.
Yeah, unfortunately today media is a business, and so therefore it has an invested interest because it has a bottom line. And I think that's a really beautiful thing about social media, is it allows us to speak the truth. But I'm keeping my answer short and sweet.
So maybe one last question, possibly? One last? Okay.
Emily Gummer.
Emily Edmund.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say it's pretty incredible to see 3 powerful women on stage who have motivated so many youth. So I just want to say thank you.
Now
guys.
we have 4 powerful women on stage, though.
Cool. So I work with Alliance for Climate Education, and we're in the U.S. and we work with high school students. I also had my awakening moment in terms of the youth climate movement at Montreal. And so I wanted to ask for all of our youth in the U.S. who can't be here and who don't have the opportunity to experience this kind of an awakening moment, where would you point them? What would you tell them? Where can they find their awakening moment if they can't be here?
We have a base team in Australia. Like the way that we're looking at these negotiations is that we have a team here and a team back home, and they're both just as important. So we have people organising a lot of work. I won't go into what it is, but yeah, that's I guess our role as a movement is to create the moments and the opportunities for people to really feel the power of what we're trying to achieve, and then build their own power for us to create real victories. So there's lots of moments everywhere, not just in Copenhagen.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not completely sure how to answer that, because I know, like, as far as the Indian youth movement that's been building, it's just because one person gets inspired by another young person they've met, who get inspired by another young person that they've met. So, like, all I can say is look around you. There's some pretty amazing young people all over your country, all over the world. It's just a matter of looking.
I think my advice would be that nothing is too small as a first thing to do. And so you don't always know when you do that first small thing that it's beginning a course of activity that may change your entire life. But listen to those voices in your head and in your heart. And, you know, when we had a political administration where we couldn't move anything and we had state legislatures that couldn't move anything, what we did have were elementary school students and high school students and college students that were willing to ask the question, why can't I just make the place I go to school a little bit better? They asked that very simple question, and then they said, if nobody's going to answer that, I'm going to try to answer it. So I'm going to ask my teacher if we can change the light bulbs, or I'm going to go to my school principal and I'm going to say we should do things differently. And it's those little things that trigger unbelievably huge change. And I am so inspired by the Alliance for Climate Education. It is like, you know, a wet dream as an organizer of a youth climate movement in the United States to think about the fact that hundreds of thousands of high school students and, you know, K through 12 students across America are getting presentations that are inspiring them to act about climate change and energy. And perhaps that was a bad analogy, but, you know, there is alcohol being served and it is 8:30 at night. So it is a dream. Let's just call it a dream. And so anyway, we should dream big and nothing should be too small.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank our fabulous and very exciting speakers. I really want to say that these are some really inspiring people, and I'm really excited to be able to bring them to this group. And let's all give them a round of applause. Programming.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. That was really inspiring, and I'm so thrilled that we were able to open the Fresh Air Center tonight with y'all to talk about what we're doing now and what the future is going to look like. Your generation is paving the road for future generations. I want to just invite people to tomorrow evening's event. Again, from 6 to 8, we're going to host a happy hour thanks to the UN Foundation, Google, YouTube, Oxfam, and RDC. At 7 o'clock, we'll start with our evening programming. That's going to be a debate/discussion on carbon markets. and it will be moderated by Naomi Klein. Two speakers are Michael Dorsey, aka Professor M.K. Dorsey. He's assistant professor in Dartmouth College's Environmental Studies program, director of the college's Climate Justice Research Project, taking a look at how emerging carbon markets shape justice-based climate policies. He's an advisor to the Obama administration. And then he will be debating Dirk Forrester, who's the managing director of NatSource LLC, which is an environmental fund management and advisory firm that does carbon trading. He was previously the chairman of the White House Climate Change Task Force under